Hi, I'm Andy Marks from the Centre for Western Sydney, and I'm here with my colleagues, Dr. Rhonda Atawi and Tom Nance, also with the Centre, to discuss, you guessed it, the New South Wales state election. Before you say, wait, isn't that already done and dusted? Well, yeah, it is, but we need to find out what happened and exactly what was different about this election for people in Western Sydney. Before I go any further, I want to acknowledge traditional owners and pay my respect to elders past and present, and note that we are on Indigenous land. So, Rhonda, we know that, of course, the New South Wales Labor government is forming office. They do require the support of some independents because they're in minority, but that result is clear. But Western Sydney was a pretty lively place during the election. Some of the swings to Labor were double digits, and Tom will go into a bit more detail about them shortly. But it's pretty clear that voters in Western Sydney had a strong sentiment to change. And what do you put that down to?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as it's been noted in the past, Western Sydney was the most visited region in New South Wales in the lead up to the election, really speaking to the importance of the region and its communities in determining the outcome. What we did see was a change in community sentiment in maybe some of the values of the community and what they're looking for in politics. And it really resulted in an astronomical win for Labor in key seats that had kind of swung back in favour of the Labor government. So it's been really interesting to see, firstly, the critical role that voters in Western Sydney have in determining the outcome, but also the change in demographics that might have been really influencing some of these shifts in the way that people vote.
Is that predominantly about younger voters engaging for the first time, do you think?
Yeah, so no doubt Western Sydney is one of the youngest regions in New South Wales, but also I think we saw that women had a significant influence on the outcome, similar to the recent federal election, but definitely younger voters under the age of 35 influencing these results this time around, who are now more highly educated and skilled than ever before. Yeah,
so we can firmly, I guess, put to bed the notion that people in Western Sydney aren't necessarily politically engaged. It looks as though they were very engaged.
Absolutely. And I think seeing like a radical shift in voting patterns really speaks to that change. And also, as I said, a reflection of that change in skills and people's political, knowledge, the way in which they engage with politics, and also what they expect has shifted and increased as well.
Yeah, look, now, I think some good points Rhonda's made there, and we know that, Chris Minns made a big effort to engage with the youth vote. I think he's since shut down his TikTok account. But Rhonda speaks to the idea that it was a very big surge in the main to Labor in Western Sydney, but it was lumpy as usual. So it was big in parts and less so in others. But take us through the key highlights.
So, I mean, it is lumpy even when you look at the seats that Labor picked up. So big swings, big surges in voting towards Labor in places like Parramatta, Campton, Riverstone. And really, a lot of that, particularly in Riverstone and Campton, was this pushback against a perceived infrastructure lag around transport, around schools, around health. And they really punished the Liberal Party around that in those electorates. But then really modest kind of swings that just kind of got them over the line in places like Penrith, 2.2%. East Hills was about 1.7%. And so that got them just over the line. So in actual fact, a lot of the key marginal seats before this election are still marginal next time round. It's the interesting, rather large swings like we saw in Parramatta that have really propelled that seat into a nice, safe proposition for Labor.
So much was made about the idea that Parramatta, for example, is a high proportion of renters, as I understand it, and affordability continues to be an issue. And much of government rhetoric, certainly from the coalition, was on home purchase. But the renters kind of got set adrift to an extent.
Yeah, and I think that really showed in places like Parramatta in terms of the voter pushback against that. And I think also there was a sense in the context of rising cost of living, rising mortgage rates, that in high growth areas like Campton, like Riverstone, there wasn't enough that the Liberal Party was doing in terms of satisfying cost of living pressures.
So a point for both of you, and perhaps you first, Rhonda. It seems as though the days, and we talked about this a little bit before the election, the days of big infrastructure winning votes, as in rail, roads, etc., might be over, that they don't seem to be getting people over the line now. It's more about schools, health and housing, those fundamentals now. Would you agree?
Yeah, I think that in general we're seeing a real appreciation and a priority on social infrastructure, and they're the services, the facilities that get us through our day-to-day life. Without education, without healthcare, our communities can't meet their needs. And in an economy where we have rising cost of living, even more uncertainty than ever, and fears around inflation, these concerns will definitely be a key priority for people in providing for their families and meeting their basic needs of survival, essentially.
Does this sort of say, Tom, that Labor were really successful in cutting through on that message?
I think so. I think so. Labor, in terms of their policy suite, were able to hit that note that resonated with a lot of voters, particularly public servants, when you look at the lifting of the wage cap. But I'd actually challenge in some way the notion that big infrastructure doesn't win elections. It will never win an election alone. But talk to residents of Camden who are still waiting for a train line.
Yep.
Talk to people within growth areas who don't have connectivity unless they drive. And we know that Western Sydney is heavily car reliant. And I think both the future government, or the Labor government, as well as the Liberal opposition, really need to start looking at transport holistically in Western Sydney, not just connecting the west to the east and back again, but the connections within the region, particularly given the construction of the Western Sydney Airport, which will be opened imminently.
And we've long talked about the need for the west to be connected with itself, north, south, etc., etc. So that transport question is going to loom large, I'm sure. Now, this gets to the idea about local politics, because as you've sort of indicated, people voted pretty differently depending on where they were in Western Sydney. You've mentioned East Hills and Penrith remained quite marginal. Other areas saw big surges. Why is that? I mean, we said it would be a hyper-local campaign, and we said that people spent a lot of time locked down, a lot of time in their neighbourhoods, so they were very focused. But were there other reasons, other factors? I'll go to you first, Rhonda, on this. Is it now the dawning of an era of hyper-local politics that we're seeing?
Yeah, I think that this election really demonstrated the importance of trust and connection with local community. And I think we saw that result in Parramatta in particular with the election of Donna Davis. So, her long-standing connections with the community, her being embedded in that community, and all of the work that she's undertaken, Parramatta really worked favourably for the Labor Party. I think that's an example of the importance of being embedded in local community and in serving those communities and building trust. I think of one of my colleagues who spoke about, Peru Car's kind of door-to-door, campaign, and arriving at her door in a sweat from walking around the streets of Penrith. But really, it speaks to the importance of that local politics and being grounded in community and understanding local community needs, being committed to those needs, and earning trust in that way through that meaningful engagement.
So I'm going to pick up Rhonda's point, which is a good one, I think, about the Donna Davis effect and the Nathan Haggerty, the Karen McEwen, the Karishma Kalianda, the kind of local government influence. So is it the case that local government, more than ever, is the apprenticeship for state membership?
In some ways, yes. But I think what we've seen across every seat that Labor picked up this election in Western Sydney is that local presence. Now, for people like Nathan Haggerty and Karen McKeon, of course, who picked up Penrith, there is that local government presence. But then you look at Kylie Wilkinson in East Hills, who has the presence within the not-for-profit sector and the community groups. You look at Warren Kirby in Riverstone, who was the head of the local business chamber and heavily connected and really advocating for the needs of business and residents within Riverstone. For me, it's not necessarily local government, it's local orientation.
So, Tom, this means then, we'll go through some of their cabinet in a moment as well, and Western Sydney features quite prominently, but it almost elevates the role of the backbencher. So the humble MP in the era of local politics can be pretty influential, all those figures that we've just mentioned.
Yeah, definitely.
They won't have a ministry, but they will have a considerable say.
Definitely. And if you look at, so of course, there were high-profile retirements from the Liberal Party prior to the election that they paid for. But you look at Kevin Connolly, who was a, quote-unquote, humble backbencher, but held Riverstone quite well. And perhaps, crystal ball out, it might have been a different result in Riverstone if he'd still been there.
Yeah, that's right. We saw that one change hands, of course. Now, I'm sticking on this theme of local, and I'll go to you first, Tom. Does the comparative lack of, I guess, success overall of the coalition, or the Liberals in this case, in Western Sydney, speak to deeper issues at the local level around branch level politics?
It's always something that's quite controversial for everyday voters. They want to see the end result, which is a candidate, and they want to be able to vote for that candidate and expect a candidate that not only resides in the community, is across the community's needs, but also reflects the community. And we saw a lot of high-profile stoushes, if you will, around pre-selection. Parramatta was just one of those. And the result was a lot of scepticism around whoever took the chair or took the nomination.
Yep.
And that really played out. I mean, Katie Mullins, who was the candidate for the Liberal Party in Parramatta, high-profile, I guess, pre-selection battle, didn't fare too well when it came to polling day.
Yeah. Look, so I think there's probably some reflection needed at the branch level. Always is for both parties, but I'd expect the Liberal Party at the moment more so. Rhonda, we've talked a little bit about local politics, but does this suggest to you if branch politics is not, I guess, proving to be that successful, does it suggest to you that people in Western Sydney voters are looking for a different kind of connection with politics or a different kind of engagement?
Yeah, I think in general, kind of building on what Thomas said previously and what we've been discussing is really, I think that voters are looking for people that reflect the needs of their community, that also reflect the demographic makeup of their community, and that they're as diverse as the communities in which they're serving. So I think that is a really key and critical area. We have seen it in this new incoming government, that there is a deeper reflection of Western Sydney communities within representatives. So I think that is critical, but also, again, having representation that is aware of, engaged with, and actively working within the communities in which they serve, I would say overall is critical.
And I'm sure you'd agree with me, Rhonda, that it's very hard to do that when you've got a branch of 40 people making a decision about a candidate to represent an electorate of 20,000. And the reality is politics now is so inaccessible for a lot of people. It's not as easy as joining your local branch. There's a lot of things that come before that in terms of your literacy, in terms of your understanding of politics, before you can even influence that way. And we see that playing out. We see that playing out time and time again when candidates are picked who are picked by 40 very well-intentioned people who just don't reflect what the community expect.
I guess we saw that writ large too in, the success of independents like Judy Hannon out of southwestern Sydney. I mean, former Liberal Party member, right? But we didn't see the surge overall in independents that we might have expected. It wasn't that there wasn't a teal wave. And I'm venturing a little bit out of Western Sydney here, with the exception of Brad Hazard's former seat, of course. And Pittwater was, I think, a close run thing too. But so what's behind all of that, do you think, Tom? I know preferential voting differs. But
It's, I guess, particularly in, when we looked at the independents doing quite well on the North Shore, it's the thing of, well, I'm a lifelong Liberal voter. I can't bring myself to vote for Labor, but I no longer support the Liberal Party, and this is an independent who I can identify with in terms of those values. But that's the really interesting thing. That was the teal wave on the eastern seaboard when we look at the North Shore, when we look at parts of Melbourne. But when we talk about the independent wave, or, the move away from two parties in Western Sydney, often we look at Daly and the groundswell there, which was really about local-based politics with a trusted local person.
It's the theme for the day, isn't it, really?
Yeah, and look, I would actually hypothesise this election would have been very different if in that sliding doors moment Frank Carbone did throw his hat in the ring for Cabramatta.
Well, that's a big call.
It's a big call, but,
A very big call. I won't offer to comment on that issue. But I think what we can say is that, this was a campaign, as we've described it, where the heat was taken out. There wasn't the aggression or the conflict necessary at the leadership level. It was very locally focused. Is that going to carry through this term, do you sense? or will things get ugly again as we enter Parliament?
There's a lot of variables there. The first one is the Liberal Party needs to pick a leader, and that will really set the tone for the party. If they pick a combative leader, they will engage in that way, and it will be really a test of discipline for Labor not to buy into that confrontational politics that has, punctuated the, decades of politics within New South Wales. But if it's a more collaborative, a more pragmatic leader from the Liberal Party who is in tune with the overwhelming public sentiment that this rise above was a good thing, we might actually see, dare I say it, a bit more bipartisanship break out. Perish the thought.
We'll hold you to that. Rhonda, do you sense that the public are over, with confrontational, weaponised opposition and aggressive politics? Do you think that's behind us?
Yeah, I think so. I think if we kind of look back at thinking at the branch level, it might be that kind of inconsistency and that sense around tension around politics that does sow more distrust.
Yep.
And I don't think government can afford to sow further distrust in our communities, especially coming out of the COVID-19 lockdowns, particularly in Western Sydney. We need consistency, and if we can't trust our leaders, that's going to cause further distrust, less engagement with government, and continue to sow fear and insecurity in communities at an economic time where we can't afford to do that.
Yeah, good point, and a good point. And I think we've touched really nicely on the issue and the importance of integrity. Now, you might have thought for Labor that getting over the line was the easy part. Now comes the governing, which has its own challenges and opportunities in Western Sydney. Let's walk a few of them through quickly if we can. I want to land firstly on the issue of health. And Tom, to you first. We've got very big issues in the health space in Western Sydney. What does Chris Minns and Ryan Park do?
Oh, well, they've started off on the right foot in terms of the public's mind in terms of removing that wage cap for nurses. That's a really popular, I guess, choice, not just for public servants, but for the broader picture. Nurses were one of the unsung heroes of the pandemic. They're really well regarded.
That's a bit of a pivot too, isn't it? Because I think that the coalition certainly focused a lot on infrastructure. And precinct development in hospitals, etc. But this is more of a workforce.
Yeah, there seems to be more of the workforce focus. And yes, the Minns government has committed to a bunch of upgrades in Western Sydney. Fairfield Hospital, Blacktown Hospital, a review and a business case for a hospital in Badgerys Creek to support the Aerotropolis. However, there is that real pivot towards workforce, and how do we support workforce? Because the reality, and everyone knows this, is if you don't have a workforce that is operating optimally, and that means they're not overwhelmed and they're not underpaid, you're not going to have good health outcomes.
So, Rhonda, turning to health, and a thing that came up, during the pandemic, of course, was the need to engage with multicultural Western Sydney and cultural diversity, Western Sydney's great strength, effectively through the health system. Do you think that will be a priority?
Yeah, I think that the incoming Labor government comes from a position of real advantage in kind of being on the outside looking in on what went wrong during the COVID-19 lockdowns, and also a position where they're not going to be held accountable for what had gone wrong. So they can really start from an advantage in learning the key lessons, especially around cross-cultural communication, which was not done effectively, and really to the detriment of public health outcomes. I think the incoming Labor government does have that advantage to really learn from those lessons, to do a better job, and really invest in engagement and consultation with the communities where they hadn't been able to effectively do so within the Liberal government at the time of being reactive.
Yeah, that's right.
So it's really a moment to be proactive in addressing those issues.
Now, I'm going to stay with you, Rhonda, on the theme too, which I think probably has some similarities around education. So how does Labor engage that issue in Western Sydney?
Yeah, so I think we've seen a really similar commitment in terms of lifting the wage cap for teachers, which is a welcomed improvement, and also a very proactive way in addressing some of the burnout and the exodus of teachers that we saw during the lockdowns. So I think that is a really fantastic start. We do have some key critical issues in Western Sydney specific to our region that might be a challenge that would be facing the incoming government, particularly around digital connection and exclusion that we've seen across the region. There are parts of our region that remain less less connected to the internet,
Yep.
less connected to the devices that they need
Yep.
for public education and overall, but also really thinking through early childhood education and the connection between those needs and the workforce would be something that the incoming government should really take into consideration.
Yeah, absolutely. Tom, anything to add on that front?
I think for me, Labor have at least started on a really strong note of looking at the entire lifespan of education, if you will, looking from early learning, commitments in terms of primary school, in terms of high school, but also looking at how we beef up TAFE and make sure that that's well funded and well resourced along with our tertiary institutions.
Yeah, I think
And that for me is the really key thing. And when we talk about implications for Western Sydney, having a really robust and stepped out approach to that is going to do wonders for boosting economic participation, but also engagement in education in places like Fairfield, in places like Liverpool, who have significantly lower rates than other electorates. And for me, that's the real pivot that will hopefully pay dividends for all people in Western Sydney.
Now, we're treating these issues a little bit separately, and we are in the home stretch, so I'll ask you to quickly canvass these last couple of points. But transport has to be a big factor. So education and health outcomes are very substantially affected by accessibility, and transport's a factor. Early on, the Labor government has said it might rethink some projects like the Sydney West Metro, etc. What's your thoughts on that?
It's one of those really tough ones. Often the big infrastructure projects are where you start going when you're looking for savings, and Labor have been very open about inheriting a bunch of costs they weren't really aware of prior to getting under the bonnet. And so for me, that seemed an obvious place to start. But really what needs to happen is a considered approach towards those, I guess, savings, but also looking at how they can be costed out over the long term. So it isn't off the table
Not off the
altogether,
books, but maybe the time frame
we need
is
to look
stretched.
at the time frames.
Okay.
And particularly as well, we need to look at the priorities in terms of where are the areas that are most significantly disadvantaged when it comes to transport, and how do we deliver transport on a mass scale rapidly? And that's the big question.
Okay. Anything to add on that one, Rhonda?
I think that's all great. And, really, when I think about Western Sydney, particularly around the growing populations, I think that place-based approach really needs to consider where the areas of Western Sydney that are really carrying most of the burden of growth in a way.
Yeah.
And, it is an opportunity, but it also is a significant burden on local services, but also there needs to be transport and infrastructure that supports that growth and the connection of those communities, but like you said, within the region and across the city to access the services that people need.
So keeping on the theme of things that people need, you, Rhonda, were co-author of a really impactful report just before the election, State of the Arts in Western Sydney, which examined the wonderful flourishing of arts and culture in this region, but the great disparity between its funding compared with other parts of Greater Sydney. Arts and culture has to stay on the radar because that's what makes it all worth living for, right? How does the Labor government address that issue?
Absolutely. So our report, unfortunately, did uncover that since 2015, there have been funding inequities that have persisted for the arts and culture sector in Western Sydney. And a lot of it comes with us having really limited cultural infrastructure within the region itself.
Yep.
So most of the money and the funding from government is being funneled to the key institutions that are located outside of Western Sydney. So in addition to that, the programs within the region aren't being supported. And despite this, we have a really vibrant sector. We have amazing organisations that are doing such incredible work, particularly with culturally diverse groups and First Nations communities. However, they're not receiving the funding that they need. So kind of going back to our point around the importance of social infrastructure, the arts is such a critical part of that broader suite of programs and services that need to be funded, but also we need to see them as such a critical part of the vibrancy of our state. I do think that the incoming Labor government has really acknowledged the critical role of the arts in really centering the arts in the upcoming tourism plan, so really shifting away from the Opera House or our key landmarks and actually marketing tourism and the arts within tourism as a key component of that.
Yeah.
And I think Western Sydney is a really central part of that strategy, should be a central part of that strategy, and funding really needs to be distributed according to our population and the opportunities we have here for really building up our profile in that regard.
Yeah, good points. And I think we'd all agree on the importance of really accurate and transparent data in this regard. And, that's something I think we need to improve on as well. I won't go too far behind the scenes, but we did have some struggles in accessing data for the report. So hopefully that will change. Tom, we can't let you leave the discussion. This is the man who gave us the phrase casino on every corner. And no, he's not working for the club's lobby group. He's actually talking about the issue of problem gambling. And Tom released a report not long before Rhonda's State of the Arts report into problem gambling. We know that there were some very big differences in commitments made between Perrottet and Minns on this issue. Where does Labor go now?
It's a good question. It would be very different if they formed majority government.
Mm-hmm.
However, they are relying on the confidence and support of three crossbenchers who were very pro gambling reform.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's going to be incredibly interesting to see whether any concessions need to be made or whether Labor have a bit of wiggle room, but also whether they can step their policy in a way which really reflects the overwhelming public sentiment. And I think,
which is that the public, you think, wants something done on this issue?
There's quite a bit of momentum that way.
Yeah.
And of course, the approach is different. The reform advocates are really unequivocal about the fact that cashless gaming needs to be implemented. However, it's going to be very interesting to see the next 12 months where the debate goes.
The lobbying power and the leverage of the club's lobby group is incredibly strong. We've seen that in the past. Is that something that Labor's prepared to take on early in the term? They've been very, very powerful lobbyists.
It's a tough one because they will obviously need to manage the various fires they need to put out, and they might not want to necessarily light new ones so early within the term. But the question would be, when is their best opportunity to take this on? Because the club's lobby present a very compelling case that clubs are the centre of the community and so are pubs, and they do a lot of good things. That is true. But also on the other side, you have gambling reform proponents who actually point to clubs and pubs really utilising a business model that capitalises on the suffering of people. And in Western Sydney, that's truer than anywhere else. And so it's going to be a very tricky dance that Labor needs to do in terms of this. They've already committed to some reform, which is great, around signage, around political donations from pubs and clubs, which are really important. But where it all kind of falls down is people are looking for cashless gaming, and whether they stick to their timeline, which is a trial of 500 machines, which is a fraction of the machines in Western Sydney, let alone New South Wales. It's going to be interesting to see if they can withstand that political pressure and hold the line in that approach.
I was going to ask you, if you're a betting man, which way would you go? But that would be incredibly poor form. So look, that says to me that it's time for us to wrap up our discussion. It's been incredibly helpful to know what's happened in the last couple of weeks. And of course, we have a really exciting period ahead as government comes together and we have some of those hyper-local issues addressed, hopefully at the parliamentary level. And we'll be back to check in regularly, I promise. And I'd like to thank Rhonda and Tom for joining me today. And please engage with the Centre for Western Sydney. We are lobbying for and with our region, using evidence to improve the lives of people in Western Sydney. And that requires your voice just as much, if not more, than ours. So stay engaged through the website and through socials, and we'll be back soon.